Bonjour à tous et
Good afternoon, everybody, and delighted to be with you once more in Aix-en-Provence. Welcome to this session. The title is, Are we capable of anticipating new crises? Of course, this is an important question when we are faced with the COVID-19 health crisis and the crisis in the economic world. Will the world of the post-COVID-19 be a world that will be many different crises? If we can anticipate the crises, how can we predict them or foresee them? So we have Gianmarco Monserrato, who's next to me, almost. He's CEO of Deloitte France. Thank you for being here. Eric Piolle, the environmentalist mayor of Grenoble. He's also a candidate for the presidential election. Welcome. Caroline Atkinson, you are with us. You're joining us from Washington, the senior advisor at Rock Creek. Hello, Caroline. Welcome. Alan Posen is also in Washington. Adam Posen, who is an American economist, the chairman of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And also Adam Posen is in Washington also. Welcome. And then we have Adam Tooze, also on the other side of the Atlantic in New York this time. He's a professor of history at Columbia and president of the European Institute. Before we begin this session, Andrei Katapanis is a member of the Cercle des Economistes, is going to give us the framework for this session. Thank you, Stephanie. First of all, when we answer the question, I don't think there's an ambiguity about this. We will have new crises in the world after. The question is to know what kind of crisis, what they will be, the scale, where and when. And rather than trying to give any definite answers, I'll hand over to our guests. I'd just like to perhaps specify the question that is asked by giving a number of additional pieces of information. First of all, to anticipate new economic crises, we have to understand this question in two ways. Anticipating means foreseeing. Anticipating also means preventing. Make sure the crisis does not occur. The second point is the concept of an economic crisis, which is very extensive. It's very much used by economists. In fact, it's a concept which has to be taken in a very broad sense. Many phenomena can be involved, and in particular we have to distinguish, and the economists also do this, to distinguish between small and large crises. Small crises, it's not so much the small scale, it's just when they don't affect the productive potential. When they don't affect the output cap, there's a difference between growth and potential growth. The major crises, the ones we've seen in 2008 and also have been caused by the pandemic, these are crises which jeopardize the growth and can reduce growth and have much longer and more serious consequences and deeper consequences on economies. The third point I'd like to make, apart from any prognosis and any forecasting, we have to decide what are the possible causes of these crises. And to do that, we have to remember that whether from the point of view of economic theory or from the point of view of economic history, crises are always of two types. First type of phenomenon is the existence of a certain number of weaknesses, of imbalances or tensions, which can be macroeconomic in the balance sheets of banks or in debt of states, of governments, which in a way is underlying the actual possibility of becoming a crisis. And the second type of phenomenon, which we call shocks, are events and new elements, climate crises, financial crises, geopolitical and social crises, and it is these shocks which transform the weaknesses into crises, which will then lead to an interruption in trade and very clear modifications of prices, for example. So what is very important in this regard is to identify which are the underlying sources and causes, because these underlying causes are predictable, whereas the shocks are not predictable. We have to adapt to events which could not be predicted. Finally, I think that we can divide up this theme of this session into three sub-questions. we can give different versions of the questions we have, and we hope our guests will be able to enlighten us about. First of all, what are the types of crises that we have to prepare for? Financial crises, debt crises, crises in the economic and political systems, referring in particular to the challenges of transition regarding climate, and in the developed countries, are they on the emerging countries? In China, are they in the United States? So the first question, where is there the most risk of seeing new crises? The second question, which is more transverse, is what are the domains? What are what we often call the global risks, where the risk of seeing a certain number of difficulties because of the ease shocks are the highest? And finally, the last question, and I'll end here because I don't have much time left, is what are the most urgent issues today, not in the long term, but in the short and medium term, that the public authorities have to take up in order to minimize the risk of seeing new crises, whether they may be large or small. And this could then obviously have an impact on economic activity and on individuals as well. Thank you, Andre. But Adam Tooze, you are a historian on this panel. I'd like to start with you. Do you have the impression that history is repeating itself? The pandemics and the financial crisis, are we learning lessons from history, do you think?
I hope the technology is working. I think to use the classification which you've just offered, I mean, I think it's useful to start by saying that we're facing novel types of shock. And the two that immediately, of course, bring to mind in light of the experience of last year are the pandemic itself, which, to my mind, though I appreciate your emphasis on climate, to my mind, it may turn out to be the zoonotic disease formation dynamics of the Anthropocene, which, well, they already have. The shock that we suffered last year was, after all, worse than any predicted by much of the climate modeling, at least, for normal scenarios for climate change. That kind of catastrophe was really a huge surprise, though the virologists and epidemiologists has given reason to us to fear it. And the second major shock was indeed geopolitical. And I'm not one of those who believe that, as it were, the tension between China and the United States is in the historical stars. It's something that's ineluctable. We can't escape it. But we do have to reckon with it as a potential source of shocks to the system. And the damage to the global trade system was evident already before 2020. So I think that's on the side of, as it were, novelty. And we should expect more of that kind of tension going forward. On the side of persistence, and I like your emphasis on, as it were, structural weakness, we can also, from the experience of last year, I think, pick out two dimensions at least. One is the vulnerability in certain labour market structures and social systems to these kind of shocks, which is a standing invitation to crisis. And the American labour market is one instance of this. The fragility of labour contracts there on the one hand, and then the mass of global informal labour, which are the people most vulnerable to these kind of shocks. So those are persistent structural vulnerabilities that open us up to the possibility of crisis. And the second is the enormous scale, dynamism, but in the end also fragility of the global financial system. And the single most, as it were, surprising thing that happened in the financial markets, after all, was the tremors in the US Treasury market that became visible in March 2020. And I think that points to another structural vulnerability. It's not the same as 2008. So in this dimension too, we see change. But broadly speaking, we are talking about market-based finance and its fragilities, highly leveraged maturity transformation going on through structures outside the banks. And the third element, which I think one has to consider when thinking about the history and the future of crises, is the type of response that we see from government. In some respects, after all, this moderated the scale of the shock last year. And to that extent, also, it was quite novel. The scale, the speed of the response on both sides of the Atlantic, and indeed across the world, was unprecedented. But I think there is a huge question mark going forward. And we know, after all, that much of the long-term damage to the Eurozone economies was done not in 2008-9, but in the squeeze that was applied after 2010. And that, I think, is the fragility that I would be looking for going forward from 2020 as well. How do the political economy of the fiscal and monetary response play out in a structure as still ramshackle as the Eurozone is, say, to that horizon of 2023, which is now being much discussed as the moment of normalization.
Merci. Caroline Atkinson, vous avez travaillé au FMI pendant la crise de 2009. À cette époque, tout le monde a été surpris.
You worked at the financial crisis to 2000. We were all very impressed by the scale of this crisis and the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. Adam Tooze was mentioning the possible financial crisis. Is it possible to anticipate this kind of financial crisis? Do you think the finance policies carried out by the central banks today can lead to a new crisis? Caroline Atkinson.
Thanks so much, and thanks very much for including me.
We just lost you. Allez-y, go ahead. Caroline Atkinson.
Okay. Thank you very much.
We lost you again. We're going to retry. Caroline Atkinson, à Washington. Caroline, vous êtes avec nous? Bon, on va faire une petite pause. On vous retrouvera juste après.
Okay, we'll have a little break. I'll turn now to Eric Piolle, who's next to me. You are the politician on this panel. Eric Piolle, you are a candidate for the primary for the environmentalists and also as for the presidential election next year. Adam Tooze has talked about social and political and financial crises. To what extent do you think you could anticipate a political crisis, bearing in mind the abstention rate, which was very high in local elections here in France? So is a democratic crisis and, of course, the climate crisis. Is there a way of anticipating this kind of climate crisis? Yes, thank you very much, everybody. Hello, everybody. Yes, as looking at this as a politician and also as an industrialist, I worked for 18 years in industry. The question of robustness of a society is absolutely central. And the role of a politician is to indicate how we can get civilization and communities to be perpetuated in the long term. This is our role, to emancipate members of society and to make sure the communities are perpetuated. Moving on from what you were saying earlier in your introduction, when we talk about predicting or foreseeing, the financial crisis of 2008 was predicted by a number of economists several years in advance. The speculative bubbles were so huge that people said that it was bound to burst at one time or another. We also have to prevent these crises, as you said, but we also have to train, we have to practice reacting to these crises. And also, we have to prepare for these crises, even in our city. In your introduction, you were talking about what we experienced in the world before in the emerging crises, and now we have systemic crises rather than emerging crises. In practice, we can see that even on a modest scale of our generation, we have been through several major crises. 89, which was a positive crisis with the falling of the Iron Curtain. Then we have seen the major strikes in 99 in France. I was working in a factory, and that's had a big impact on the way we did things. And then we had the stress in 2003, where although Europe wasn't affected directly, we had to take action and prepare. At the time I was working in a multinational. We could also mention the Icelandic volcano in 2010, which paralyzed air traffic, and which had major consequences. And more recently, with Evergreen, which has shown that when you have a situation where a ship is blocking the canal, you can imagine with the ports, with the rising water level, if you block one of the major parts of world infrastructure, this has major consequences as well. So the question is, how do we make society more robust, and can we make sure we have a secure change? And we have to look at this through many different prisms with geopolitical tensions and financial and health crises. This has also been described by other people, but we don't prepare for them because we consider that the cost of preparing in economic and terms and time and the efficiency in looking forward and projecting ourselves into a crisis, this is difficult to do and difficult to anticipate. Say, okay, we'll just carry on, keep our head down and keep going, and we don't try to anticipate. So there are major challenges here, especially in the democratic field, because we can see that our business model is going to switch over. We cannot go through what we saw in the steelmaking and coal and textile industry in the 1990s. If we go through this again in the future with aeronautics and automobiles, we've seen with the Yellow Jackets movement in France that in practical terms in society you can have things that completely change the situation and can cause a major upheaval. And these can have a major impact on our societies. So that's an important central impact, central point for us. And also the question of anticipating the crisis. If we don't have crises, climate change isn't a crisis. We know what's going to happen with climate change. With the underwriters highlighting the impact of, I saw this recently, for heating of 3.4 degrees. They estimate this will represent 18 points of GDP in the world level, which will be eradicated. So that is a central question. We've just had the report from the Higher Council for the Climate saying that we're going at half the speed we should be going in terms of our changes we need to put in place. And so our responsibility as politicians is to work with scientists to make sure we have a clear roadmap. I'm not saying that climate change is not going to have an effect. No, it is going to have an effect on us. To attenuate and adapt, these are going to be central points. We have to make the change is secured. I know that in a previous life as an industrialist, when Gorbachev was in power in Russia, who was one of the major players, of course, in the changes in the world in the 1980s, where we had an exchange about how we could make our interconnected world more robust. And just after that, we saw a strong example because I was in a company which had relocated all its call centers into Tunisia, and these call centers were closed down from one day to the next by the Arab Springs in the spring of 2010, 2011. We have a strong scientific horizon, so absolutely vital to take account of this and get on the right trajectory, because then we can't say these are crises. These are just the effects of mechanisms we knew were underway. Adam Posen, I hope you are with us. You're an American economist, chairman of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. The financial crisis of 2009 began in the US. The health crisis began in China. We can see these crises are becoming worldwide and very quick. We have the impression there's a kind of acceleration of these crises. As Eric Paul has said, some of these rang the alarm bells, especially in 2009. Even Bill Gates mentioned a worldwide pandemic was possible several years ago. Could this crisis have been anticipated? And will it be possible to anticipate the next crisis, do you think? Adam Posen, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm sorry I cannot be in Provence with all of you in person. I have a different, slightly more depressing take on this. The issue isn't can we predict crises. As you've mentioned, there's a host of warnings and predictions on the most important crises, on climate change, on the risk of pandemic, on financial excess. And we, the community and we policy types are always failing to address this. And it's not just economists. So if you look at the history of intelligence in the sense of spying, military, national security, we see similar phenomenon. Everybody told the US that Japan, and they broke the codes, that Japan would attack Pearl Harbor. Stalin was informed and advised that the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact would not prevent a German invasion. France, before the attacks in 1940, had collected copies of plans of German war efforts, and that did not work to get inside action either. There is an old but very good book by Richard Betts called Surprise Attack, which talks about the fact that you can have all the intelligence, but the decision to act is different. And the same is obviously true now on health, on environment, and on financial issues. So one way out of it, people used to think, was going more automatic and more rules-based or more technocratic. But as we've seen, A, the technocrats may make fewer mistakes, but they still make some, plenty. And B, the technocrats don't always get legitimacy. So the usual response, as some of the other panelists have said, is to make the society more resilient. But resilience requires long-term thinking as well. So I think the hope remains to do things at the international level and to try to impose extreme transparency and burden sharing, which locks countries in. And we are just going to have to incrementally keep working at that. Even there, we have problems. We've seen how the IMF has been hesitant to call for problems on various member countries because they don't want to offend member countries and they don't want to provoke a crisis. And we're seeing a similar dynamic to some degree with the WHO right now. So there are no easy answers, but I do think continuing to push for greater transparency and greater international rules in most of these fields is the best way forward. Thank you.
Une réponse internationale. Caroline Atkinson, est-ce que vous êtes avec nous? J'essaye de vous...
Caroline Atkinson, are you with us now? Are you able to join us? Have you been able to link up with Caroline Atkinson again? Here she is. Caroline Atkinson, can you hear us? To react to what Abin Posen was saying.
J'ai l'impression qu'on a toujours un problème de liaison avec vous.
Yes, I can hear you.
So let's do it then. Est-ce qu'on pourrait aujourd'hui anticiper une crise financière?
Could we perhaps anticipate a financial crisis that it would be systemic in the same way as 2009? For you, as somebody who was at the heart of the IMF at the time, the central bank policy is going to generate a new financial crisis? To talk about one possible factor in this possible future financial crisis.
Manifestement, on a toujours un problème avec Caroline Atkinson. Bon, j'espère qu'on finira par la voir. Gianmarco.
Okay, we seem to still have a problem with Caroline. Gianmarco Monseliato, your turn. You're CEO of Deloitte, and so you advise companies. And companies also have to deal with all of these crises and these health crises, financial crises, economic crises. How do they anticipate those crises? I'm going to talk from the point of view of a microeconomist rather than a macroeconomist. I'm talking from the point of view of a business which is a smaller scale but is more directly affected by the crises. We can sum up the function of a business leader as being one of the roles has to be to anticipate crises. Etymologically, in ancient Greek, the crisis means you have to make choices, you have to make decisions, which is a good definition of leadership as well. Although we don't ask that question very often in a company, we often wonder what company directors and company leaders are for. It's when a crisis occurs, that's when a company director plays their real role. That's when they make it possible for the company to continue functioning and to have a heading for the future. And that really crystallizes the importance of leadership. Our customers themselves, when they are able to anticipate a crisis and to anticipate a crisis occurring? No, that's not really possible. The history of humanity shows there's been a series of crises which have forced humanity to take various choices and decisions. The crisis will continue in the future. Certainly what we can say is the next crisis will not have been predicted. That's certainly true. So it's important to be able to take action and to hold the rudder through these storms that are caused by the crisis. This is important. We have to be able to run and direct our own company. One important compass to help business leaders is to navigate through these difficult times, to be ready when the crisis occurs, and to be a leader in a time of crisis. The first point of this compass is to listen to the future and not to be trapped by the illusion of linearity, which is a trap. Linearity never happens. It's just an exponential curve that has not yet developed. If we look at the budget, we think the budget's going to carry on for the same way for the next 10 years. We know that's not going to be the case. To anticipate what the deviation is going to be, we have to know yourself. Let me take an example of a customer. Everybody has quite well predicted that there would be a problem with the supply chain in China. Not many people had foreseen the major problem would be with North Italy. When Bologna closed down, a lot of supply chains were completely disrupted. Everybody looked ahead. Nobody realized that in reality, closer to home, in Bologna, we would be dependent on these supply chains. If you know your strengths and weaknesses in advance, you'll know where it's going to hurt. The third point is we talk about resilience a lot. If we look in the long term, you have to be ready and you have to learn from the past. You have to be able to remember previous crises. To talk about ourselves, we were ready to have everybody working remotely when COVID happened. We didn't wait for COVID to happen, but our emergency managers were ready. We had the processes in place. When COVID happened, everybody was able to work remotely from home, and it worked very well, except there's one thing we hadn't planned for, which we need to look at in the future. We hadn't planned any future on morale and the tiredness and fatigue of our employees. That's something we hadn't foreseen. So thanks to our memory, that means next time we'll be able to incorporate this into our response so that we are be able to provide a better response to the next crisis. And the last point, which is an echo to what I've just said, is have an inclusive culture, not just within the company, but also because everybody has to be concerned, but also with the stakeholders. It's not natural for a business leader to be inclusive with their suppliers, with their customers, but it's the only way for me to be able to manage a company through a crisis and to preserve their ecosystem. It's really the compass that has to guide us and our companies.
Adam Toombs, we find you again. I think Karen Atkinson can't manage to connect herself. For the crisis, for the historian you are, what will be tomorrow's crisis like?
It's a nice question to be asked. Historians are arguably the wrong people to ask that question of. But I mean, I would double down on the diagnoses that I offered in my opening remarks, in that one should expect it to be right now, as it were, the rational thing to do is to project out from our current situation and what we saw exposed last year, in the last 18 months, were three types of fragility, which I've already spoken about. The pandemic risk, which is something that the scientists tell us to expect more and more of. The weakness of the financial system, that is a chronic problem of our modern form of economy. And then a variety of other shocks that we also have to reckon with, I think. And earlier on, one of our panel members spoke about politics, and I wasn't able to hear Adam Posen's remarks, but speaking to you from the United States, I don't think we can avoid talking about it, which is that the advanced economies in the United States, which for so long has been, as it were, an anchor of global stability, is now increasingly fragile. And the period of normality that we're experiencing with the return to office of the Democrats and the Biden administration should not lull us into complacency about this. We saw last year a fairly comprehensive crisis of governance in the United States, faced with a challenge that was predicted, for which the American government machine was as well prepared as anyone, but without effective political leadership from the top down, with a political system that was on the edge of, well, it was immersed in the rhetoric of civil war, if not the reality of civil war, and an election whose outcome, as we all remember, but I think have quite rapidly repressed, was contested for months afterwards. And that truly is a source of instability which we have not had to reckon with before. So if you take, as it were, what we have seen in this Petri dish of 2020, if we think about that we can see coming out of that, there are familiar elements of weakness, a social system which is under pressure, under the pressure of mounting inequality, a financial system which is inherently fragile in certain respects. And we add to that mix the three dimensions of the pandemic challenge and the other anthropocenic risks that we are likely to face from that pipeline, the escalating tension between the United States and China, and the very serious instabilities within the American political system itself. And that, for me, is the map which we know. That's the map of crises to come that we already have in front of us. If, speaking to you in Europe, we add in the well-known frailties of the Eurozone's political economy, I think that completes the mix. Over the horizon, and I noticed that one of the colleagues on the panel works in Africa, of course, there is an entire panoply of further crisis scenarios that one could see unfolding. But right now, from an advanced economy point of view, that will be the cluster of tensions that I think all policymakers are in fact focused on. The question, I think, fundamentally, and it's been raised and hinted at various points, and this is where I'll conclude, is simply whether or not we're capable of taking our own crisis predictions seriously enough. That surely is the fundamental question that comes out of 2020. We cannot say that this crisis was not unpredicted. It isn't just people like Bill Gates. There are entire apparatuses of government devoted to the project of preparing us for risks like the pandemic. And in practice, we failed faced with this shock. And it was by no means the worst type of shock that we could have experienced coming out of that pipeline. It turned out not just to be a technocratic failure, but our political and social systems proved very fragile in response to this crisis and struggled to find. It's delightful to hear stories of strong leadership, but very often, of course, that was absent last year. And I think that is really the central question. Whatever the specific diagnosis one might make, do we have what it takes? Is our political system able to digest, and are we collectively able to act on the ample signals, the ample warnings that we're receiving? You know, in a sense, reflexively about this meeting here, say we concluded there were a certain series of risks that we were able to diagnose here, us smart people on this panel, what would we do about it? That, I think, is a key question going forward. And there are certain things we should be asking about. As our politician friend reminded us, we know what the climate crisis is, we know how large it is, and all the available evidence, not just in France, but in all the advanced economies, we talk a good game, but right now, exactly as he says, delivery is at about half the level it would need to be if we were actually taking this seriously. So that, for me, is, as it were, the key question of the moment, not the specific diagnosis of any one particular crisis, but a process of introspection about whether or not we're capable of taking any of our own well-founded diagnoses as seriously as they need to be taken.
Merci. Eric Piolle, justement, vous pouvez peut-être rebondir sur l'action politique dont parle Adam Tooze.
Eric Piolle, can you respond on this, on the political leadership? How do you take into consideration all these crises? How do you tackle that? How do you address and know the consequences of your action when you wanted to increase the carbon tax, for example? There was a yellow vest for yellow jackets. It wasn't anticipated at first. Well, yes, but it was foreseen by some. It was already foreseen, but I think there's in the political action, I think there's a triple stake here. First of all, you have to be realistic. Now we are faced with climate warming. We have clear messages that we receive on the need to adapt, doing nothing or moving too slowly is a big risk, which is terrible. In fact, it doesn't make sense. When I worked in industry, in our bigger systems, we did FMEA measures. We analyzed the risks, the defects, the consequences, and everything, and we tried to see what percentage of risk of the occurrence of risk and what would be the consequences if it killed us or not. And that was a first block. But I'm struck by seeing that today we're still, publishing our documents or sending our documents at the higher level, and at the second level, we're not preparing our strategic documents, which are still lacking. So two major stakes. The second level is training, being trained. And Grenoble at the City Hall, when in January 2017 there was the big risk of electrical breakdown, instead of saying, well, let's wait and see, and we see if the distribution system would react, we decided to post on all the buildings and public buildings, or those who would suffer from the breakdown, well, we put a panel up saying, there will be a power failure in this, in such and such a case. And so this helped having neighbors visiting older people, elderly people, and warning them. Someone who had respiratory assistance, we told them that they could be affected. Heating, for example. So we developed resilience. And when masks were distributed, I proposed to the President of the Republic that we took this advantage to test at a scale of 1 to 1 how we could distribute those masks in a record time. That's what we did in Grenoble. The masks, it was a bit late, but it's this crisis management. You're not anticipating. Yes, but it's training. We're being trained. And when I say, if we do it right, you know, when it happens again, when we need to distribute something useful for the whole population, we will have been trained. And so the third element is how we can get rid of the bubbles, you know, how to reduce the risk. That's what is happening with the task force of financial disclosure, integrating accounting rules, the issues of climate warming. Integrating all this is very important. Will happen very rapidly. How to manage in the results of enterprises the climate risk and eventually other risks, and the work that's being done around accounting standards for 2023, 2024. This enables to mitigate the risk because we transform negative impacts. This is something we haven't managed to do. We were always using the methodology of Jean-Baptiste de Sée, who said that the resources of the planet are plentiful, and we know that we have reserves for we had 350 days. Now we're at 200 days of reserves. After 200 days, we have used up all the resources of the earth, and we're actually taking on the capital of our resources. So we will have to disinflate the bubbles, and question of accounting is really pivotal in able to factorize the externalities and risks in the results of enterprises. And the fiscal aspect, also the tax aspects, this will be, for me in any way, an idea of fighting against the accumulation of capital, which is negative. It was Stiglitz's book, The Triumph of Cupidity, because this triumph of cupidity generates the exploitation of the planet and social inequalities. And so this is important, as Stiglitz says. And this belongs to another rationale. Alan Posen, how can public policies act? Because we're in the response that you mentioned. Can they give rise to the future crisis? Joe Biden's plan that is extremely massive, does that also include the next financial crisis, because it will be too hard to digest? But the example of the impact of a public policy, can it generate itself a crisis?
Il faut que vous remettiez votre you have to put back your microphone.
Your microphone is not on, Mr. Posen. Your microphone is not on. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? We can't hear you, sir. Adam Posen?
De son.
No, we have a sound problem. I'm sorry, sir. Hello? We cannot hear you. Your microphone is probably switched off. Hello, Mr. Posen? Oh,
hear me now? My apologies. Thank you for coming to me with this. I am actually more optimistic on this score than I was on the prevention or awareness of crises. I think there is very little evidence, at least in the macroeconomic financial sphere, and arguably in some of the other key spheres we're talking about, that policy responses cause crises. One pattern, for example, that I identified in work on Japan and in the banking crisis of the 90s in Canada and Scandinavia was the fact that following a banking crisis, one tends to have a very long period of expansion, relatively low financial instability, and generally slower but steadier growth. And this is indeed what happened in the US and most of Western Europe following the global financial crisis, and would likely have continued absent the pandemic. There always is this claque of people, be it from the BIS, the Bundesbank, various investment funds, who insist that, oh, monetary ease or fiscal ease will create the next crisis. And the answer is that's not in the data. Bubbles tend to be serially uncorrelated, negatively correlated. If you have a big bubble, particularly in real estate or financial system, you don't tend to have a significant bubble very soon after that. And moral hazard of bailing out people in crises, supposedly, is vastly overstated. And so we have instances where you actually get some progress as a result of crises. In a sense, if I look at how well the core banking system in US and Europe, and therefore in the world, did in response to the shocks of the pandemic, the financial lockup a year ago, March, April, and when the pandemic first hit the US and Europe, the response to the Archegos hedge fund blowing up, a number of the things that were put in place by the G20, by the FSB, by the central banks ahead of this period because of the last crisis helped us get through this crisis better. So when you mention the Biden situation, and I am largely on the side of my colleagues like Olivier Blanchard, Larry Summers, and Jason Furman, that the first package that the Biden administration passed in January of this year was probably excessive. And in composition, it had too much money going to people who didn't need it, as opposed to the very useful spending on public health and vaccinations. And so I do think that this may mess us up in the sense that it may force the Fed to raise rates more and sooner than they otherwise would. And therefore, we may get a downturn sooner than we otherwise would have. But is that a crisis? I think the political people and the people on this panel and the historians like Adam Tooze would tell us the crisis came because we did too little last time. And that's what caused the backlash against austerity, caused, at least in part, I mean, not in all, but in part, Brexit and Trump and many other bad things. So I can be much more optimistic. You should deal with the crisis head on, full on, and not worry that you're going to cause the next crisis.
Thank you, merci beaucoup. Est-ce que Caroline Atkinson est avec nous?
Caroline Atkinson, are you with us now? Do you have a connection? Caroline Atkinson, does it work? Are you with us? Yes, we can hear you on the phone. Yes, correct.
Speaking on the phone, everybody. I want to agree with my two colleagues in the US. One, with Adam Rosen, we have seen that economic and financial crises can actually be addressed, and they have been addressed now and in the past year. But I Adam Tooze that with the political problem of leadership.
On vous entend vraiment très mal.
On the
Allez-y.
on the that may use the feedback. So on the issue of social property, we have seen that in Europe.
Caroline, je suis vraiment désolée, mais on vous entend vraiment très mal. Donc j'espère qu'on va résoudre.
Caroline, we're very sorry. We can't hear you. We're sorry. We hope we can fix that before the end of the session. We still have 15 minutes to go. Who wanted to react? I don't know where we were here. Gianmarco Monserrato didn't have a second round, so what would be your reaction? We saw that Adam Posen was more optimistic on the economical policies. Regarding enterprises and businesses, if we take the climate crisis, how do corporations, enterprises anticipate crises of this type or others? There's a problem with the climate, of course. So how do you face that? Well, I'm like Adam. I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because, as you mentioned, the world of businesses, and in particular the world of finance, has already taken into account, is actually taking into account these issues because they're reasoning on the long term. You mentioned accounting, but finance tries to quantify negative externalities, the climate being a major one of them. So to the stakeholders, it gives a vision to what happens if an enterprise or a business doesn't reform itself. So it's an awareness for all stakeholders. When we start quantifying a topic, economic topic, we move from philosophy to reality. And once the financial world has committed itself on this path, we see an acceleration of actions taken. When I say I'm optimistic, I'm not. It will be a favorable way of considering the climate crisis as a simple it would be a mistake. The climate crisis touches a lot of things. If we pull out of the Chicago school thinking that the economic activity is only there to produce profit, it has to be profitable, but there is a common thing that is shared here. We have to reinvent the meaning to the economic adventure beyond exclusive benefits or profits. What do we contribute to? What do we contribute to? What is our share? What is our part in the ecosystem? And if we will solve the climate crisis only if we ensure that we implement the right transitions while maintaining, preserving the hope of the youth, the economic hope of the youth. If we use the Malthusian logic, it's not the yellow vests we will have. We will have a social revolution, economic revolution. That's where it's difficult. How? If I think strategy, for example, I say net zero by in the near future. Never board a plane. Never work with your colleagues on the other side of the Atlantic. No. This is. We will solve these issues by taking into account externalities, by reinventing a development model with the support of public authorities. And I will conclude by saying on one topic, that is a management rule. You need courage. You need courage because when there's an increasing risk, there are an increasing number of solutions. So it'll be difficult to quantify the choices, but instead of trying to conserve things, well, you have to build and find a new balance, not abandon, but build something new for all the stakeholders inclusively. It will take time. We've started that. We're not. It's urgent, and we have to ensure the sustainability of our system. It will be the role for the next decades. 10 minutes to go. A few questions on the tweets in Aix-en-Provence. Should we associate citizens on this anticipation or in the crisis management? How can you associate the public, the people? Well, there are several dimensions. One that makes reference to what I was addressing earlier, daily training on sanitary or technological crisis or what have you, or more systemic type crisis. But there's also a strong stake around democracy inside enterprises, inside business. This will be very demanding if the changes are not done by associating the democracy, the inside democracy within enterprises, while we will be faced with severe shocks. We need to invest democracy in our paritary system, but also inside businesses and corporations, and keep training. This is what we try to do in Grenoble. We've been doing this for 7 years. Training to local democracy takes time because you need to develop trust, a trust that was damaged, and it's being rebuilt in action, in the hope, and it's the title of the book I just published, Hope, and it's fueled with action. So a question on capitalism. Economic crises are often caused by the capitalistic behavior, which always tries to get more profit. Shouldn't we review the capitalist approach and privilege economic solidarity? Well, and can anybody, Adam Posen, would you have an answer to propose on this? If you heard the question? Yes.
It's an interesting idea, and it's not one I've heard before, so it's taking me a moment to figure out how to respond. I think the idea of pushing on hope remains the right approach. And I fear, however, that trying to think about this in terms of our democratic societies or global societies in general is going to be ill-fated. I fear it's going to depend a lot on local political and economic conditions. So while this idea to me presents a positive path, I'm not sure how applicable it is outside of certain places.
Est-ce qu'il faut revoir les règles du capitalisme? C'était ça la question.
The rules of capitalism, should we review the rules of capitalism? Always aiming at making more profit.
Non, pas.
Sorry,
Monsieur Monchato, peut-être.
Capitalism is just a global word. It was born with liberalism, which was the capacity for all individuals, whatever his birthplace, to build himself or herself an economic future. And I was saying we have to pull out of the myth that that economic activity, the aim is only to build profit. No, it's a mean to build and share. It's not capitalism that you should review. It's the use we make of capitalism. So we can only take one question from the room. Can we? Can I take a question from the floor? If anybody has a question, yes, madam. No microphone. Sorry, we don't have a microphone. So she's talking roughly about bringing together the human person and the economy, but the rest I don't hear. I can't hear. No.
Donc, quelle est votre question?
Comment on fait pour gérer ça? C'est-à-dire qu'on ne peut pas tenir des discours publics comme quoi il faut...
Very sorry, there's no microphone in the floor. We can't hear the question.
Et tout au long de l'entreprise, quand l'entrepreneur est encore, en tout cas fondateur, et que le capital n'est pas dilué, c'est l'entrepreneur qui porte le risque au quotidien. C'est lui qui dort plus la nuit. Voilà. Donc il faut l'intégrer dans le discours parce qu'on n'entend pas assez. On a l'impression que les entrepreneurs, c'est juste les grands patrons. Non, il y a plein de petits qui tous les jours distribuent. Moi, je redistribue énormément. Mais en même temps, il faut faire aussi des choses.
Éric Piolle, peut-être, vous pouvez répondre comment...
So maybe the answer will give us the question. So in fact, there's an overrepresentation of the bigger business groups in the political debate. Why? Well, because they're better organized, they have means, they have structures, they have a heritage, and this gives rise to a democratic question. Democratic questions, which are to see, the multinationals, we're committed in climatic justice. With Grand Saint in France, we took the French government to court. So for me to refound an economic activity which has three objectives: guarantees security to those who act and invest, sharing common goods, and given sense. And that's where we reinvest entrepreneurship in local fabric. And that's where the issue of risk is very important. We can't go back. Nobody proposes to go back to a socialist economy, a communist economy. It could be with cooperations or cooperatives and everything. We need that, but we need a public authority that sets the path so that entrepreneurs can accept to take risks. What strikes me here is then you do vote a climate law that corresponds to 20% of the charges for 2030. While enterprises know it's a problem because there will be a second, a third, a fourth plan. And so the climate is quite uncertain. We need to have a view at 20, 30 years so we can line up, businesses can line up on the societal program. You're in a political campaign. Generally speaking, I'm always campaigning, As an elected representative, I'm always campaigning. So thank you, Éric Piolle. Thank you, Caroline Atkinson. We're very sorry not hearing you. Alan Posen, thank you, Adam Tooze, and André Cartapanis, of course. And thank you all, because I suggest you stay next because the sessions are continuing. Stay with us.